Good morning, colleagues. My name is Lucille Webster, and I'm the Library Director, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to welcome back son of the soil, Prof Bawa, back to DUT. It's such an honor for us to have him back here. Unfortunately, there seems to be a problem in terms of logistics. The VC is still on his way, but because of time constraints, we would like to start now, if you don't mind. Okay. So let me take one step back again and just say welcome to everybody. All protocol observed. I'm not going to mention you by name if that's what you are waiting for. Please feel welcome. Thank you. So some of you may be very much aware of what open access is all about. DUT introduced open access workshops and lectures way back in 2009, and we've been doing it every single year subsequent to that. And it was more about conscientizing people and informing people about what open access is and the impact that it could have on a tertiary institution like ours as well as worldwide. So I promised my colleagues that I would give less than a page of introduction, otherwise we will sit here for the next 2 hours. So it's going to be a very short summary of open access. So open access was first initiated in 1991 by Paul Ginsberg. How did he initiate this? He started a repository at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The focus was to make available preprints in physics to everyone. You know, if you don't subscribe to a journal, you cannot have access. And he was trying to divert this, okay? Other leading protagonists in this and co-founders of the open access movement globally was Peter Suber from Harvard Office of Scholarly Communication and Stephen Harnett. And like all global movements, once it started springing up in the northern hemisphere as well as in the southern hemisphere. And I don't have the time to tell you how it's gone. But what I can tell you is that it did come to Africa, and we as Africa has embraced it with the Accra Agreement in 2003. The predecessor of that was the so-called I've got it here, the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2001. At that meeting, the declaration was that any research that is funded by public funds at the universities worldwide should become available to all researchers, not just to researchers who work at institutions who subscribe to a particular journal. So you can see this was all about equity, leveling the playing fields, and making accessible, making information accessible to everyone, irrespective of their financial ability. This was followed by the Berlin Declaration on Open Access in 2003, and the declaration read, "The literature that should be freely accessible online is that which scholars give to the world without the expectation of payment." I would like to say that Durban University of Technology was one of the first universities of technology in the country to sign this Berlin Declaration of Open Access, putting us firmly into the movement. Okay. Subsequent to that, there's been lots of other movements, and I think by now you've heard of the Open Access 2020, because if you count back 2001, it's almost 2020. And the Open Access 2020 was primarily driven by the Max Planck Society in Germany, and it's really gained notoriety, if you want to call it that, but certainly it has boosted the movement of open access in the world. So by now, I think you may have heard certain institutions like University of California, all academic libraries in Sweden, all academic libraries in Norway, some in China, have decided to tell service providers like Elsevier and others that we will no longer subscribe and pay these exorbitant fees that you demand of us. 2006 was a seminal year in terms of the movement because then research institutions and research funders, and the leader there was the UK Council on Research, that indicated that going forth, that all grants that have been funded by them had to be published on open access platforms. We in South Africa joined that in 2015 when NRF indicated that if they're funding you for your research, you have to publish it in an open access mode so that it is freely accessible to everyone. Other councils and research funders like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and several others, too many to mention, have now also joined the movement. So that's, in a nutshell, is Open Access 101. Now I will do the little welcome for Prof Bawa. I promised him that I'm not going to read several pages of this, so I need to stick to my word. So Prof Ahmed Bawa is a theoretical physicist. He currently hosts the position of Chief Executive Officer of University South Africa, USAF. I'm sure you all know that already. So until the end of April 2016, he was our big boss. He was Vice Chancellor and Principal of Durban University of Technology. Prior to that, he was based at the Hunter College in the City University of New York, where he was also a member of physics and astronomy. Okay, and prior to that, he was based at the University of Natal and then the subsequent University of KwaZulu-Natal as the Deputy Vice Chancellor. So Prof Bawa holds a PhD in theoretical physics from Durham in the UK. He's published in the areas of high energy physics, nuclear physics, higher education studies, etc. He served on a number of policy development teams, and he is the chair of the Foundation for Research Development, and later served on the board of the National Research Foundation and was vice chair of the board of Atomic Energy Corporation. That, in a nutshell, is a short history of Prof Bawa. I'm going to now hand over to Prof Bawa. I'm not sure whether your speech still remains, the title remains the same. Okay, let me not spoil it. You will tell us what it is. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and it's a real pleasure to be back here again, to be here at DUT. And I know people keep saying to me, sure you're happy not to be here now. And actually, it's the opposite. I really do miss being at DUT, and I not just miss the people who work here, but also miss students and so on. And somehow, now this. When I'm at USAF, you're not just focusing on what's going on at single university. I mean, whatever is going on everywhere just comes in there, And when the minister is unhappy about something, he doesn't call the vice chancellors, he calls my office. So I really do feel kind of very pleased to be back here today, and it's. It's been a real pleasure to see how DUT has sort of grown since I've been away. Actually, just a couple of disclaimers. I mean, Lucille and Segrin and so on know much more about this than I do, right? But what I'm going to try and do today is just talk about the kinds of discussions that are going on in the sector to allow us to address the big issues that Lucille alluded to. And I want to begin just by focusing in on, this is not really, I haven't got a slide on this, but just to say that we have to think about open access really as a challenge for human rights and social justice. This is really about saying, just what is it that that universities do, and what is the impact of what universities do on broader society. Now, actually, I have to just say that in some ways, there's been an acceleration about this thinking, not just about open access, but about the role of universities in society. That came from, I know that you might think that this is crazy, but that came from the Fees Must Fall and Rose Must Fall campaigns. Because in some ways, the one thing that really we have to come to grips with, if you like, in terms of the big the student activism of 2015 to 2017 or something like that, there were two major issues. The one is the role of universities in broadening access, in trying to, the form it took was around free education. But actually the big debate is not about free education. The big debate is how can we get as many young people as possible into the sector. Every young person that qualifies to be in higher education should be in higher education. And that the last thing we need in a democracy is where people are prevented from being in higher education because they don't have money. So, so that's the one thing. The second part of the debate, of course, was this very confused, in my view at least, very confused notion about decolonization and so on. And I'm not suggesting that everything is confused, but there wasn't a consistent position on what is decolonized education and so on. But it raised another issue, which is, we had the National Commission on Higher Education in 1994. It laid out a program of activities for higher education, about how higher education was going to contribute to the new South Africa and so on. What we discovered in 2015 to 2018 was that social compact, if you like, between the universities and broader society, that social compact had collapsed. That's something else, that we had left out things in that 1994 process that are now back on the agenda. And the two things, the one is massification. By the way, the students in 1994 raised the issue of massification, but it was the commission didn't deal with it. And the second thing is the issue around the radical transformation of the curriculum and so on. That too was raised but wasn't dealt with. And there's a reason why it wasn't dealt with. The reason is that at that point in time, there were deep concerns about the fact that, that we had to try and ensure that people didn't feel alienated, in particular the historically white universities and so on. That we didn't want to force people to leave the country and that kind of logic, if you like. So the issue of reconciliation was what drove that project, if you like. And, 20 years after that, those two things came back to bite us. And the students are absolutely right to raise those big issues. So I think what I'm trying to say is that one of the critical issues for us that came out of 2015, 2018 is this issue of the relationship between universities and society more generally. One of the major outputs of universities is research, knowledge. The question is, how do we ensure that knowledge is actually brought to the service of the general population? We are public universities, right? So one expects that. So this has to be seen, this project on open access has to be seen as a small part of that big, broader project, if you like. Okay, so again, Lucille pointed out that this is the title that I've chosen, and it's because the reason it's still a journey is because, we know that it's much more complicated than what I'm going to be delivering today, but we have to start somewhere and we have to make progress, because otherwise we'll just be stuck and we're not going to be making progress. So it's definitely a journey, and the emphasis is very much on scholarly journals, but actually it's also it's also of pertinence to issues around data, around just research data, around scholarly, not scholarly journals only, but the outputs of the university presses, all of those different kinds of things that come into the fray, if you like, if you start talking about this. And this issue around, I've called towards transformative agreements. What you'll see later on is what's contained in those transformative agreements with the big journal houses. So, the big journal houses are like kind of Elsevier, Wiley, Springer Nature, Taylor and Francis, and so on. Those are the kind of the big engines of, and I'll come back to them in a little bit of detail in a minute. So let's just spend a couple of minutes to talk about this, the national context, if you like. At the board meetings that we have, Professor Moyo, there's some chairs in the front here. Thanks for coming. I know you were busy. So just to say that at the board meetings of USAF, one of the constant issues that has been raised is this issue of unequal access across our sector. So in other words, like, some of the universities spend 100 million rand a year on journals. Others spend very little, not because they don't want to spend, but because they simply don't have the resources. Now the question is, can we start thinking about a new model which will provide access to all of our scholars across the system? By the way, scholars are not just in universities, right? Scholars are also in the science councils, in some government departments, in some NGOs. There are scholars across the spectrum, if you like. So the big question was, can we start looking at a kind of a greater access, if you like, to scholarly journals in the first instance across our sector, across the 26 public universities. But as I indicated, it's broader than that. Secondly, you see, the original argument used to be, not all universities are going to be research universities. Some are going to be research intensive, some are going to be teaching intensive. At DUT, when I was here, we had no pretensions to being like, we were not going to be the new UCT. That wasn't on the agenda. What was on the agenda was that where we are doing research, let's do good research. Let's do research that kind of impacts society and so on. So, having said that, you can't have a differentiated system which doesn't have articulation, see. So in other words, if a young person does a degree at, say a master's degree at DUT, there should be completely transparent and open access for that young person to move to another university, to move to UCT, to move to WITS, or to move to University of Pretoria. Now, what does that require, right? It requires that the quality of that output has to be at a very high level, that there's access to material, and so on and so forth. So this idea that, we shouldn't worry too much because some universities can afford it, others can't, that doesn't cut. What we really have to focus on is this idea of ensuring that all of our scholars, all of our postgraduate students have access to these materials. The second thing is that there's a growth of postgraduate education across the sector now. In the early days, it was that, that 5 or 6 universities produced the vast bulk of the PhDs. Well, that's no longer the case. Let me ask a question. Who can guess which university produces the largest number of PhDs in South Africa? Number 1 and number 2. Sorry? Yeah, so good guess, University of Pretoria. No, the university that produces the largest number of PhDs in South Africa is UNISA. And which one is second? Northwest University. Yeah. Yeah. By the way, Forte is not very far behind. Forte is like, 6th or 7th on the list or something like that. So, so we really have to be careful about this notion that there are a couple of universities that are like doing the bulk of the research and the bulk of the research output. By the way, the University of Technology started from 0, and now they're sitting at about 7%. So already we're seeing the influence of the University of Technology in the production of research outputs and PhDs and so on. So the big issue really is that we have to think about this not just as in terms of what the system was in 2010, but where the system is heading, just how there's a growth of research output across the sector. And I've got some numbers for that a little later on, which we'll look at. Now, in terms of, the whole issue around DST has what is called an open science project, right? By the way, it's now in the new Science and Technology White Paper, Science Technology Innovation White Paper, and basically it's a much broader concept than open access. It's really about saying, how do you democratize science? How do you make sure that by the way, when I say science, I don't mean just mathematics and physics and so on. I'm talking about the whole academic enterprise. How do you democratize that? How do you try to make sure that more and more people are participating in it? And so on. So there's a whole range of things to do there. There's a global movement, by the way, on what is called citizen science, about how just ordinary citizens are now engaging in research activities. Even in the most esoteric areas like my area, like particle physics, there are people who are who have laptops and so on, which are not working 24/7. So they kind of really they kind of deploy those to kind of be a part of a big global enterprise in producing big research outputs and so on. So there's a very strong move within our government to begin to democratize science. And you can't have open science if you don't have open access. So, there's those are completely interwoven with each other. But I just want to emphasize that open access is a very small part of the bigger project. But I just want to emphasize that it is about social justice. It is about human rights. It is about access to knowledge. It is about access to the universities. And those are the critical things that we have to keep in mind. And then the fifth thing, the vice chancellors didn't start with this in our board meetings, but this is what really drives the issue. It's the growing unaffordability. Every university now is cutting back on our journals, And not because they want to cut back, not because, they've got other priorities. It's just simply not enough money for the growth in the costs. And by the way, it's escalation of the costs in the sense that, these companies are kind of really putting up the costs on a regular basis. We have this foreign exchange instability. Every year, Lucille used to come to my office and say, but, let's cut this, let's, because of the foreign exchange. And then the industry model. And the industry model basically has been captured by, this word capture now, right? Has been captured by 4 or 5 big companies, global companies. And basically they just run the operation. I mean, they just force everybody else to fall into their kind of business model, if you like. So, just to give you a figure, see, our current subscription costs are between 500 and 600 million rand a year. National. By the way, those are figures from SANLIC, and some of the institutions we discovered, not institutions, but like the science councils and so on, some of them are not even members of SANLIC, and they are buying journals. So, this is a conservative estimate of how much we are paying at the moment, 500 to 600 million a year. And then, of course, there's the spend on APCs. That's separate, okay? So on the article processing charges, we really don't know yet how much we are spending on article processing charges, okay? So clearly, just if you just take the national context, there's a project here. We have to kind of take this on. And somehow we have to kind of galvanize ourselves to kind of achieve a better deal for our universities and our science activities more generally. Okay, so just to give you some idea, right, of how research has grown between, this is 2010 to 2015. By the way, 2018 figures are even more impressive, right? And so just to say, look, DUT between 2010 and 2015 in research output per capita, per academic member of staff, right? That's a bit kind of complicated because you have to work out how you're going to count academics, So what if somebody is working half-time? And so you have to kind of work that out. But research output per capita, look at DUT. From 2010 to 2015 went from 0.08 to 0.4. By the way, when I got here, I was totally shocked with this figure. I just said, my God, what have I come to? But by 2015, it was already 0.41. I don't know whether you know what the latest figure is.
Yeah, so it's over 0.78.
0.78. So it's almost,
0.78 was
yeah.
the last time.
Between 2015 and 2018, it's already nearly doubled again. So it's an indication, that there's a massive growth, right? University of Venda, look, went from 0.24 to 0.71. UJ from 0.069 to 1.16, and so on. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of it together. And clearly there's an indication that between 2010 and 2015, there's been a rapid kind of escalation, if you like, of research outputs. And look, this figure here, what I want you to focus on is this figure here. This is the 2015 figure again. The total number of research outputs, the total number of peer-reviewed articles, whether they are books, journals, or conference proceedings, the total number was 22,000 in 2015. In fact, in 2018, I have to get the date right now. In 2015, that figure is now 24,200 or something. We have had a massive increase from 2010 to 2015. It's nearly doubled. In fact, by now it's doubled. Now, does anybody know what the reason for that is? A very simple reason. It's the research output grant. Yeah, the research output grant at the DHET. We had long discussions with DHET about how to, because prior to 2010, from 1994 to about 2005, 2006, we had hit a plateau. We were just seeing no increase in output. And the big question was, what can we do to kind of get this acceleration, get an acceleration outputs? And then together with big discussions, NRF, DHET, universities and so on, and then there was the introduction of 2009 was the introduction of the research output grant. And that kind of really accelerated the output. By the way, there's a story behind that which tells you that actually, universities are very susceptible to steering, right? If you want to change universities, put some money on the table. And then the universities respond. They respond well. Okay, so which are the areas of research strength? See, biomedical and clinical sciences, 16% of the total research output. Look at business, economics, and social, 10%. Social sciences, 9%. Physical sciences, 9%. Life sciences, 8%, and so on. Okay, so really kind of indications of where we have growth. Okay. Now, one of the big challenges for us, of course, say there might be some, for example, stuff around the information technologies and all of that. There might be some of it here and some of it there, but it doesn't appear in the top 10, say, of our research output stuff. Okay. Here's interesting. So South Africa's research output is about 1% of the global research output. By the way, I'll leave these slides if people want to use, if you want to. If 1% of the research output in South Africa 1% of the global output in research is South Africa. South Africa has a 1% share of the global research output. That's very good, by the way, because we have way below 1% of the global community of scientists, right? So we punch way above our weight in terms of research outputs, okay? But here's the really big story. See, look at this figure here. If you take the top decile of those articles which have the top decile of those articles that have the highest impact factors, highest impact in terms of citations, we have a 10% share of that. It's a very good sign. What it means is that we're not just growing our research output, there's also high quality, okay? So, of course, now there's another side to the whole story. I'm sure you've seen the newspaper articles about publishing in predatory journals. People are slicing and dicing the journals because they want some money, for research purposes and so on. Those are all big issues, and I think we have to take on those issues. Those issues are around the ethics of research and the ethics of publishing and so on. We have to take those on full. But they by no means form the bulk of our research output. By the way, the extent of publishing in printed journals is 3%. It was 3% in 2005, it is 3% last year. Now, that's not a small figure, by the way. It's an important figure, but it's by no means the bulk of our research, as the sensationalist reporting kind of puts out there. Okay. Right. Just some detail. This is an interesting figure. It's now 57%. 57% of the research output in South Africa, in terms of publications, is in collaboration with international institutions. Now, there's two ways of looking at that, right? The one way of looking at that is to say, that's great, because we are connected with the global knowledge enterprise, we're working with best people in the world, the best people in the world are coming to work with us, and so on and so forth, right? So that's a very good sign. But it's also a challenge because we have to ask ourselves, who's determining what those research projects should be? Are we determining it, or is it being determined? Now, it's an interesting question, and I think we need to kind of explore that. So if you take, for example, the medical sciences, what we call biomedical and clinical sciences, almost all of that research is shaped here in South Africa. It's a very good sign, because what it's saying is we are shaping those research questions. And to be honest, I think a part of that story in those areas has got to do with the fact that a very significant amount of funding for those projects comes from overseas. By the way, the Americans don't give us the money because it's from the goodness of their hearts, right? It's because infectious diseases it knows no boundaries, right? It knows no borders. And they know that if they don't deal with XDR TB, HIV AIDS, and so on, that it's just a question of time before it spreads around the world. But still, what it does tell you is that it's a number that we have to pay attention to. That if that figure grows much more, we have to sit back and say, well, what's going on here? Can we begin to do some analysis of this? The second thing is 30% published by women researchers, 32% by black researchers. By the way, these are from 2015. I suspect they've changed to some extent. And here's an important figure, 45% by researchers above the age of 50. And the big question here is are we generating are we producing the next generation of academics? Are the younger people coming through? Are they going to kind of fill the shoes of people who are kind of exiting the system? I'm going to be 65 next year. I'll be out of the system. So, are there people coming through the system who can start taking on this responsibility of producing high quality research and so on? Okay. By the way, I've been reminded that actually it's a risk to present this like this, because what it doesn't tell you is what's happening amongst women, white women, black women, and so on and so forth. So that has been brought to my attention, and I don't have the data for that, but it's something that we have to look at. Okay, so now we say, well, in terms of this, how do we, in terms of the whole issue around open access, if we agree that open access is a big project, by the way, the board of USAF, right, has kind of made clear that this is a big project, that we have to. By the way, the board is made up of the 26 vice chancellors and myself, 27 of us. It's a ridiculous board. And Professor Mthembu is not here. So let me say, from my point of view, working with vice chancellors is like herding cats, right? It's a hard job. Yeah, fortunately, I was a vice chancellor, so it gives me a kind of insights. So the big question is, so the board has accepted this is a big issue and we have to address it. And I indicated what the big national context was, right? Okay, so the first thing we could do is we could say, well, look, let's just see if we can strike a deal with the publishers on getting what we might call a national site license. Several countries had done that. Pakistan, Canada, Brazil, and various other countries had done that. What they did essentially was they went to Elsevier and so on and said to them, right, okay, at the moment, this is what the universities are paying Some of the universities are paying. How much more do we have to pay to make sure that all South African universities have access to the full suite of journals? Seems like a logical thing. Seems like of course, now you do the calculations, you start the discussions, you start negotiating, and it turns out, in fact, that the cost is just grows. Okay, those companies are not charities, right? I mean, they want to make profits, right? So they see this as a profit-making opportunity, and so the other big thing about the National Site License is that only scholars who are registered with universities, staff and students, would have access. So in other words, the idea that this would become an open access model is not there. Okay, right? And then, of course, there's a whole range of other issues around, what we are doing is essentially just keeping that business model intact, because what we are saying is, irrespective of what we do and so on, we're going to pay you for this additional access. So basically, we'll be paying to read, and the industry model will remain the same. Secondly, that we'll have to pay more for the national site license. Now, of course, now that we look at those countries that had the national site license, like Pakistan and so on, they've all kind of now withdrawing from it. Brazil has already withdrawn, and Brazil has kind of adopted the position that we have adopted, which I'll come to in a minute. Copyright remains with the publishing company. So in other words, when you publish an article, don't think you own that knowledge, okay? You're selling it. The company takes the ownership of that, okay? So you can't take that article and publish it in a repository, in an institutional repository, because it doesn't belong to you. It's weird, okay? Okay, and it was clearly, after we did our studies, there was a big ASAF study that was done in 2010, which indicated, in fact, that this was there's unaffordable and so on. And ASAF is the Academy of Science of South Africa. And they've been doing some work in this area for quite a while now. Clearly unaffordable and certainly unsustainable in the short to medium term. We just didn't have the money for it, okay, basically. Okay, actually, we pay 4 times, right? I mean, first of all, public funds is a dominant part of funding for research. Actually, we have to be really worried about this, because until recently, until 2016, the private sector funding in research was higher than the public sector funding. And now that has reversed. So we have to be worried, because we have to ask ourselves what's going on. Why is the private sector not investing in research anymore? So that's something which we have to focus on. We pay for APCs at times, okay? Not every time, but then we pay for peer review. We pay for the editorial committees. I don't mean we actually pay, but the staff, the people who do the peer reviewing and the editorial committees and so on are all academic members of staff. So, and they don't get paid for doing those things. So the universities are paying, right? It's public money that's going in there. And then you pay subscriptions to pay for a pay-to-read model. So we pay 4 times, see, 4 times. So just to give you an idea, Elsevier last year, 2018, Elsevier had a 40% profit margin. By the way, in those big companies, 40% is an unthinkable kind of profit margin. But when you look at these details, then it's not, we shouldn't be surprised, that it's making so much money. Okay, oops, I think I've gone. Okay, so now we say, well, what's going on locally and internationally? What can we start working with if we're not going to take this national site license approach? So I just want to get this. I've set up a clock here. I don't want to. Sorry. Oh. I said, what is the time? I didn't start it. 5:12. Okay. Okay. So now we have new local and international trends. Just to kind of ask ourselves what's going on. There's an acute awareness for the need of new models. First of all, I mean, everybody is agreed. You know what? We have to move away from this current model. So first of all, there are new open access journals that are being initiated by scholars in certain fields. I mean, for example, in artificial intelligence now, they don't publish in the usual IT kind of journals and so on. They've created their own journals, and the reason is because there are many reasons, but one of them is that the traditional journal model is just too slow for them because it's such a galloping field, okay? By the way, the Human Genome Project, which was based at the University of California at Berkeley, they did the same thing. But they did the same thing for an ideological reason. What they said was, this is public money, whatever outcomes come from here must go into the public domain. So they created their own journals to kind of publish the stuff, right? Okay, secondly, by the way, I just want to emphasize that they didn't kind of say, okay, it's open access as in no peer review and so on. Okay, there's no such thing. It was properly peer reviewed and all that jazz. Next one, new not-for-profit publishing houses have been established. And what that means essentially is that there were there were companies that have been set up which are not-for-profit companies, but which publish journals, okay? So, and that is a new kind of phenomenon, a new kind of, and the indications are that they work well. By no means are they as expensive as the others, because it's not for profit, they're not generating profits. And they do all the kind of usual kind of peer reviewing and so on in the usual way. And by the way, many academics are saying, no, I'd rather work for not for profit than to work for academics who do peer reviewing and so on, right? So then there's the Open Access 2020 program, and that one I'm going to spend some time talking about a little bit, is to temporarily move from a pay-to-read to a pay-to-publish model. Basically what it says is, let's not stay with the subscription model. What we'll do is we'll take the money that we are spending on subscriptions and we'll use that money to pay to publish. But once we pay to publish, what we are saying to those publishing houses like Elsevier is, once we've paid to publish, then it's open access to everybody. And we'll talk a little bit more about that just now. And then there's this acute awareness that copyright must reside with the author, that we can't possibly just hand over the copyright to these journal houses. So then we have to make some assumptions, right? That we still need peer review, that there are costs related to production, and there are costs related to editorial work and layout and all that jazz. And no matter what model we use, there are costs associated with these things. We can't just kind of, we can't just imagine that we can move to a model which is completely free. Okay. Now, whether we need peer review and so on is a debate. It's a bit of a debate. I was in a debate with Raju some while ago. Not a debate, but we had a kind of, we kind of shouted at each other against the room in the room. So I just have a simple thing. If I write an article on the Higgs boson, which I have done, I'm not going to put that into a repository which is going to sit there and, I want the physics community to look at it, and to say, well, actually, this is nonsense, or it's like, it's good, like, so, and now, we might move away from that model, but at the moment, that's the model we have, right? Okay, so what does it say, right? So first of all, this doesn't negate other open access strategies, okay? More radical ones, which will move us ahead. For example, this idea of not-for-profit open access publishing houses is a model that we really have to think about and think hard about, okay? So the other thing I just want to emphasize is the Open Access 2020 model is not saying, so just listen to me carefully, right? Is not saying, let's do away with the high impact factor journals. It's talking precisely about the high impact factor journals, right? So the Open Access 2020 model does not say to academics, please publish here but not in there. It's not saying that at all. What it's saying to the publishing houses is take your high impact factor journals and put them into this new model. Okay. So the idea is really to transform the core of today's scholarly journals from a subscription base to open access. And we're going to do that for the first 3 years by paying for the move from subscriptions, from pay to read to pay to publish. Once we pay to publish, then it's open access to everybody. Globally open access, right? Secondly, it's this idea of that we have to pursue these transformative agreements by converting the current resources we have. So we are saying to the publishing houses, please don't come and ask us for more money. This is the money we have, and this is the money we want to use for this new transformative agreement. Okay. Then there's that we want to engage all parties, that it really has to be a kind of a bottom-up project and a top-down project. And then copyright must reside with scholars, and there has to be transparency. See, when a university signs a deal with Elsevier, there's a clause there. The clause says you can't reveal this information to anybody else. There's a non-disclosure clause. So what countries did, like Sweden and so on, and other countries, what they did was take us to court, but we're going to break it. So they made the information public. And they said to Elsevier, now if you want, take us to court. When they did that, we discovered that we pay more per article than the Swedes pay. South Africa pays. By the way, the level of arrogance, I mean, I met with Elsevier, the level of arrogance is just unbelievable. Unbelievable. So this issue of transparency is crucial. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm putting it up here because I'm proud to be a physicist, right? See, the physicists got together and said, can we think about a new model, right? And basically what they did was this scope 3, and basically what scope, by the way, the 3 there stands for PPP, okay? So scope 3 really did the following. It said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to aggregate the resources that we have for publishing, and it's being aggregated globally by CERN in Geneva. And each country contributes to that central fund its proportion of the number of articles it produces. So I'm not going to go through this slide, right? I'll leave it with you. But South Africa's contribution is 0.5% of the global output in particle physics. So we pay 0.5% of the total costs. But once you pay that, CERN then distributes the money to the publishing houses. Particle physics articles are completely open access. In fact, anybody can click on a link on a particle physics journal and it'll open up and give you the full article. There's no you don't have to sign up, you don't have to register, nothing like that. Just click on it and it opens up. Okay? And so we want to have a similar model for all the journals. Okay? That's what we want. Okay? Now, at the moment, of course, for particle physics, it's easy because we have a big global particle physics institute. It's called CERN, right? It's in Geneva. I work there. And so now we don't have a similar thing for the global university system, if you like. So that's something we have to work towards. But basically what we are saying is we want to pay to publish. We don't want to pay to read. Okay? And once we pay to publish, then it's open access. Okay, and Lucille asked me to say a few things about Plan S. Plan S is a European Union invention, right? What they did was, they said, look, if there's any European Union funding in a research project, any European Union funding, and it doesn't matter where it is, whether it's in Europe or it's elsewhere, that we really have to move towards copyright being owned by the writer, being published in open access. I haven't got that written down here. Being published in open access. Interestingly, a whole range of other funders have now come on board. Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, and a range of others have come on board and said that we support the Plan S. There's several countries, including the USA and I think it's Zambia, has signed up to Plan S. Our NRF is considering its position. And then the National Institutes of Health in the US, which is the biggest funder of health research in the world, they've come on board. And it's aligned with different forms of openness. So they're not saying, you have to work with OA 2020. They are saying that they are, as long as it's open access, they are happy. Okay. it's a very powerful impetus, because what it's saying is, if you've got European Union funding, you better publish open access. And by the way, they're speaking to the publishing houses and so on. Okay, so just to summarize, right? So the transformative agreements essentially says that we'll use what we are currently paying for subscriptions to shift from a model of pay to read to pay to publish. And once we've paid to publish, then it's open access. And secondly, the ownership of copyright has to reside with the individual scholars. And thirdly, and so just to say that we want to see this as a national project, that we don't think that it should be that individual institutions should take this on, but that we should see it as a national project. The national project, by the way, involves not just the universities. Universities, science councils, government departments, private sector institutions that want to be a part of it, and so on. But just to say that the important thing for us, at least at this point in time, is that the science councils, government departments, and the universities have now aligned themselves around this issue. And the big point to make here as well, in terms of it being a national project, is that our vice-chancellors have committed themselves to keeping the money that they're currently spending on subscriptions, to keep that money in a pot, which will allow us to enter this negotiation, if you like, to get to this next stage in terms of open access. There's a whole lot of stuff here that we're going to do. So, who's publishing where? We have to get data. We have to get a lot of data. By the way, most of this stuff we're here will be done with data analytics. So we don't have to kind of go to each university and get data and so on. We can get that data from data analytics. But there will be actually some data that will be needed from the universities, especially around the APCs and so on. So we will come back to you and say to you, please can you tell us. By the way, it's very non-trivial because some of the APCs are paid by the research office, some are paid by the libraries, some academics just pay out of their own research grants. So when we speak to the finance officers and say, can you find a way for us to get this data, they say it's very hard. So we'll have to carry out a study to work out how to do this better. Okay, so I just thought I'll mention the USAF context, right? So number of board discussions. Initially they were about the national site license, but now it's about open access. They've agreed that we have to move away from the national site license model. There's a broad agreement to pursue the OA 2020 model. In fact, in 2017, we signed up to be a part of the Open Access 2020 model. Oh, sorry. Then there's EXCO, and the EXCO of USAF and the Funding Strategy Group. We have a funding strategy group at USAF. They had a workshop with Open Access 2020 colleagues from Berlin and so on. Really powerful meetings. There's been several workshops with finance executives, librarians, DVCs, and so on. There's a meeting, there were meetings with Cohort. Cohort, by the way, is the body that of the chairs of the science councils of South Africa. So it's the CSIR, NRF, Medical Research Council, and so on. The MinTech, and all of the science councils. And DHET and DST are part of our project. Hopefully, of course, we're also thinking in the back of our minds that we'll capture the imagination of these so that they can put some money in the pot as well, which will make it cheaper for the universities. So we have a project team, and the project team involves USAF, ASAF, which is the Academy of Science, CHELSA, the librarians, the NRF and Cohort, SANLIC, which is South African National Library and Information Consortium, right? DHET and DST. That's the kind of the team at the moment that kind of works on this. Okay. And we have a negotiating team now. It used to be just SANLIC. Glenn Truran was the is the head of SANLIC. So it used to be just SANLIC, but now we've broadened it to include Stephanie Burton, who's a DVC for research at University of Pretoria, Hadi Maritz, who's a CFO at UCT, and we're looking for one more DVC who's going to be a part of this negotiation team. So in other words, to say that when we enter these, not when we enter, we've already entered these negotiations with Elsevier and so on, that it won't be just one person, but that there'll be a team of people, of really hard negotiators, who will be able to kind of really take on those negotiations. Yeah. Okay, just one more. I think I've got a couple more slides and then I'll stop. The first one is what's happening in the international terrain, right? All the major European systems have essentially adopted the OA 2020 model. So just to give you an example, I mean, like, so Sweden said to Elsevier, if you don't enter a new trade agreement with us on open access journals, we are going to break our contract. They did it. They broke their contract with Elsevier because Elsevier didn't want to enter into negotiation. Elsevier has now changed its tune to some extent. It went to Norway and it struck up a deal with Norway on an open access model. So Norway actually has an open access model. There's a reason why Norway was chosen. Does anybody know why? Norway's population is 5 million. So it's a small system. So they're experimenting. Hi, Nikki. They're experimenting with Norway. But what it means is that if they've done it with Norway, there's no possibility of them kind of not doing the deal with other countries, right? The University of California, yeah, you might say, well, University of California, one university in the US, and so on. By the way, University of California's output, research output, is bigger than France and Holland, France and Netherlands together. So just the University of California, it's a huge system, okay? And they've essentially canceled their deal with Elsevier because Elsevier didn't want to negotiate with them. So what I'm saying to you is that there's a move that's taking place. By the way, now there's a whole range of other American universities, Arizona and various other places, which have aligned themselves with the University of California. So it's just a question of time, really, before. By the way, the universities in the US are not like universities in other parts of the world, right? Because there isn't a national system of higher education in the US. You know, University of California is totally autonomous, as are the other universities in the US. So each one has to kind of make its own. There's no national system of higher education. I have to relate this story to you. See, so Elsevier's response, not just Elsevier, but the others as well, their response to us was, we're not going to strike any special deal with Germany or with South Africa and so on. By the way, they don't even think we are important, right? Because we only produce 1% of the research output, global output. So as far as they're concerned, we are just like of no consequence, right? So they kept saying to us, no, until such time that the bulk of the researchers want the new model, we're not going to move. So I was at a meeting where there was a Chinese delegation. And the head of the Chinese delegation said to the CEOs were invited to a session, said to the CEOs, he said to them, CEOs, look at me and look at me carefully. I am so-and-so. I'm not speaking for myself. I'm speaking on behalf of the Chinese science system. It's a very regulated science system, and it represents 20% of the world's scientists. We want to move to OA 2020 model. So please don't use us as an excuse for keeping the old model going. So China has moved, Japan has moved, India, Brazil, and Russia are kind of contemplating moving, and of course we have moved. But there's a whole range of other kind of dynamics at the moment. So there's a global kind of move towards the new system. Okay, I'm not going to go through this because there's a whole range of detail here which is not necessary for me to go through. And I've also had next steps and so on, but I'm not going to go through that either. But what I did want to say was that it seems to me at least that we must be careful not to fall into this trap of thinking of this as the only approach to open access, that we have to think of other models as well. And of course, some of the models have to be homegrown, right? So for example, we do have an open access publishing platform in South Africa now, which is SciELO, which is based, which is run by the Academy of Science of South Africa. Now the question is, can we begin to use that as a platform, especially for the South African journals? So in other words, to say to the South African journals, for goodness sake, we don't want to put you into financial straits, but what we do want to do is to ask you to think of models that will allow you to be open access. By the way, South African journals are expensive journals. And by the way, there's a lot of corruption in those journals too. So like, so we have to go through a process of investigation with regard to those journals. So just to give you an example, you'll get a journal which is based at, I'm not going to name the university, right? But at a particular university. And then 70% of the articles that appear there are from that university. That's corruption, Something's going on there which is not right. So like that, it seems to me that we really have to kind of interrogate the South African journals and come to grips with which ones should be supported, which ones shouldn't, and so on. Okay. And then finally, just to say that unless we do this as a national project, it's doomed to failure because, even as a system, we can't negotiate with these big public houses, these big publishing houses of our own accord. Our individual institutions will be even in a weaker position. So we have to think of this as a national project, that we actually aggregate all the resources that we have, to take on this battle. And by the way, it's supported by DHET, supported by DST. We have to say to DHET constantly, don't think of this as your money, because it's actually university money that goes into this. Now, of course, DHET will say, but we give subsidies, but actually subsidies only account for about 40 to 50% of the total income to universities. So it really is kind of a national, it should be seen as a project that's a national project, but a project of the universities and the science councils. By the way, the universities are by far the biggest research enterprise in South Africa. We produce about 90% of the research output in South Africa. So we have to have a very big say in this. But the only way that we can have a big say about this, in this, is if we act in concert with each other, that we kind of see it as a kind of project that we can take forward. By the way, I'm not suggesting that there aren't any big debates here. There are lots of big debates. There's one more issue which we have to keep in mind. It's a big issue. And that is that, you see, we've already got 500 to 600 million rand sitting in a kitty there, which we can use to negotiate. Colleagues of ours in other higher education systems north of us on the continent don't have that. So when we enter this negotiation with the publishing houses, we have to also say to them, no, but we need a special deal for the continent. This is not just about South Africa. Okay, because what it will do is completely then leave those people out on a limb. Okay, those academics and so on. So we have to think about South Africa also playing a role here in terms. By the way, the big publishing countries are South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya. Those are the big publishing houses, but the nations. But the others also have academics, also publishing. So we have to be careful not to jeopardize their access by just striking a deal which is only a South Africa deal, if you like. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prof Bawa. I think you've done an excellent job. I know that we have time constraints. We have to get him onto a flight as soon as possible. But I'm willing to entertain 2 or 3 questions. If you have any questions for Prof. It was absolutely clear. No questions? Yes? Okay. Please introduce yourself. Thanks.
Thanks, Prof. Sikutali is my name. And if you forget that, I am Salim 2.0. Yeah. The digitization journey, what I would call the digitization journey. So you spoke about DHET supporting research. How about DHET, or perhaps that could be DST, I don't know. But how about the digitization journey within the sector being driven centrally, supported centrally, because necessarily that talks to the integrity of information, that talks to the data analytics you're referring to, it talks to enhanced operational efficiencies. Is that possible? The other point you make, it's about us as a sector. We need a carrot kind of in order to move in the right direction. Is there a way, and this is kind of outside, not too close to your talk, is there a way within the country, within the sector, of recalibrating the texture of conversations so that we become more aspirational than responding to being controlled? Yeah.
I think both are very good questions. By the way, what we are talking about here is all digital stuff. All of it is digital. So, we're not talking about kind of physical books sitting somewhere now. So it's all digitized. And by the way, the publishing houses are increasingly moving towards kind of data analytics. They're seeing that as the next business opportunity. But having said that, there are already very good examples in South Africa of how we are moving in this direction. So just in terms of, for example, the Department of Science, which is now called Department of Science and Innovation, although I understand that Cabinet hasn't yet approved that, DSI, for example, has got a very large project on what it calls DERISA, data, but basically it's a repository of scientific data. But that will include kind of the possibility of having on it kind of research publications and so on. But as I mentioned earlier, the Academy of Science of South Africa already has SciELO, which is a big database. And again, it's for the digitized material to be kind of hosted there and so on. So there are already moves in that direction. And the big challenge for us is to try and understand what different kinds of open access do we need, So it will be very difficult at this point. I'm speaking as a physicist now. It will be very difficult at this point in time for us to say to physicists, please publish in this open repository, but not in the not in a physics journal, if you like. I mean, no physicist is going to do that, because at the end of the day, physicists really want their articles kind of to be seen by other physicists, critically and so on. So now that might change in the future. I mean, I don't know. So I think that a lot will depend on what kinds of different open access routes we need. But I fully agree with you, it has to be digitized. I mean, we can't go back now to paper-based stuff and so on. Yeah. And the second point was, sorry, I've forgotten now.
Around the texture of conversations.
Yeah. No, I think that, I think this is an important issue. And, what we've done is we put out what are called open access, so journeys into open access briefing documents. We've done that from USAF, which kind of go out. I think there are 3 or 4 of them that have gone out already. But what we do is, whenever there's some new information, we try to get it out there. But I think you're right. It is the kind of nature of the conversation that needs to take place. So, vice chancellors have agreed, the finance executives have agreed. But we still have to get it into the faculty structures and so on. So, I think it's not just about the nature of the conversation, it's also the granularity, the kind of saying, well, are we getting to the people who actually do the publishing? Okay. So that's an hour. It was working.
Okay, thank you, Prof. If no further questions, one more question, yes? And we'll make that the last.
Many of us aspire to publish in leading journals. And many of these leading journals belong to the big publishing houses. Yeah. I think that is a major challenge. Yeah. In my opinion, I think it's going to take time for open access to get that stability and reputation where we will want to publish.
Right. So that's precisely the issue. That's precisely the issue. That is to say, there are lots of arguments that we should go into open access, go into platinum open access. I don't know what it's called, where it's genuinely open access, kind of where, open access journals, which you can just publish in and so on. There are people that argue that, and I think that, they come from a very good point of view. The point of view is, whatever we're doing now with Elsevier and so on, we're still negotiating with companies that want to make a profit.
Yes.
So that's the kind of logic, you know. The question is, where are we as a scientific community, global scientific community? Are we ready to kind of take that route, you know? And I don't think we can ever get away from the need for peer review and so on and so forth. And they cost money. So that's precisely why we are saying we're not talking to Elsevier about a new set of journals. We are talking about their current high impact factor journals. By the way, just to give you an idea, the University of California, when Elsevier said, no, we're not going to strike up a new transformative agreement with you, all the kind of the academics who were peer reviewers and editorial committee members withdrew. So it's an indication, it's your point, you know, it's an indication that this isn't just a project of the vice chancellors. This is a project of the academics at heart. Because if they withdraw, then, you know, then the future validity of those journals begins to be undermined. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. I really have to release Prof now. As I said, he has to be rushed to the airport. He's got another engagement. Please join me in another round of applause for Prof. Thank you.